Good evening and welcome to, I've lost count of where this is in our series of webinars. It's like number 7 or something like that. I don't know. It started off as a good idea in March 2020 when I thought to myself, oh, well, lockdown will only last a few months, so I can manage 2 or 3. And here we are in January of 2021. But still, that is to our advantage, because tonight, I'm pleased to say, we're joined with Sam Wells and Russell Rook, or perhaps I should say Russell Rook and Sam Wells. I don't want to give either of you a pecking order in any way whatsoever. We're going to be discussing topics around their book, For Good. Here's a quick subtle product placement, available from all good booksellers. If you've not read it, please do go out and get a copy, because it's well worth it. It's a challenging read. It brings up a lot of questions, and hopefully we're going to ask some of those this evening. So perhaps we could just start by both of you introducing yourself and just giving a little bit of a background to what you do and how you fill your time when you're not doing webinars with the United Reformed Church.
I'm Sam Wells. I'm the Vicar of St Martin in the Fields. In that sense, I'm very engaged with issues of social welfare, because our homeless ministry is quite extensive. I've been ordained in the Church of England for it'll be 30 years this year, although I spent 7 years in North Carolina. So I'm also a visiting professor of Christian ethics at King's College London, and was Professor of Ethics in Duke University for those 7 years, as well as being Dean of the Chapel. So I've always combined pastoral ministry and an academic strand. And my area of specialism is ethics. So I guess I was thinking about this earlier today. I think the sort of intersection of my work is where ethics, ecclesiology, and mission all meet. So it's how the church interacts with the world, and how the ordinary things that Christians do are transformative in the light of God's kingdom. That's more or less me.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Russ. You can call me Russ as long as my mum's not on the call when I have to go to Russell, but I don't think she's due this evening, so I'm Russ. And one of my friends always says that you can't call a career unless you look backwards, and my life's a bit like that. You would never have planned my career trajectory or my vocation. My day job is I work for the Good Faith Partnership, which is a social consultancy which kind of works in the interface of faith and politics. At the moment, I kind of do 3 jobs with the Good Faith Partnership. I look after 3 projects. I do a lot of work with the churches in the Holy Land to try and secure a brighter future for Christians in the Holy Land. I work with the Forum for Peace and a gentleman called Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya, who is a Muslim scholar and a champion of peace and pluralism in the global Muslim community. And I look after a project called Your Neighbour, which is a coalition of church denominations and organisations and over 1,000 congregations who are supporting vulnerable people through the COVID crisis. And then aside from that, I do a bit of work in the House of Lords. I am part of Sam's congregation at St Martin in the Fields. I'm also part of a congregation, a Salvation Army church, which I planted when I was a student a long time ago. And in between being a student and doing what I do now, I've worked for the Salvation Army, I've run a charity, I've worked for the leader of the Labour Party, I've done all kinds of things. And now I do what I do.
We could have some interesting conversations around that alone, but perhaps we'll save that for another night, should we? The book, the report that you've written is entitled For Good, the Church and the Future of Welfare. So perhaps a good place to start is, can I just ask one of you, and I'll let you choose whichever wants to answer. When you talk about welfare, just explain as a starter what you mean.
Go on, Sam.
Well, back in 1942, William Beveridge wrote a report that was really, and it's astonishing now to think about it, because it's very inspiring in the light of right where we are, like you just said. Here we are in January, we're 10 months into the pandemic. He was like at the height of the worst point in the war, 1941, 1942. He produced this report on what a land fit for heroes to live in was going to look like and how it needed to be different from the Hungry 30s. And he identified 5 social ills. And, some of the language is 1940s language: want, idleness, ignorance, disease, and squalor. And those were the things that he set about trying to eradicate. And so out of the Second World War experience, out of his report and out of the Labour government that came in after Churchill left office in 1945, was what you might call welfare in the narrow sense and welfare in the broad sense. So welfare in the broad sense was a safety net that meant nobody went hungry, nobody became destitute. There was a helping hand for the whole nation. It was described as the kingdom of God turned into legislation by the Archbishop at the time. People really believed in it, and the National Health Service was part of that in 1947 or 8. So that's everything that was celebrated in Danny Boyle's 2012 Olympics opening ceremony. That sense, he climaxed that extraordinary ceremony with the National Health Service and with the sense that this is a country for everybody. And of course, the irony of all wars is that the people that fight them are the people who've got least to gain by them having been won. The soldiers are often the poorest people. So welfare in the narrow sense is the system of benefits that, without getting too political, for the present government, they would say is now wrapped into universal credit, which enables people to manage if things in their life go badly wrong. Health goes wrong, employment goes wrong. Mental health goes wrong, those kinds of things. And it's a system of benefits. And to introduce the subject in the book, what we're really saying is the maths has changed. In 1945, 46, there were a lot of people of wage earning age and a very small number of people who were, say, earning pensions. 70 plus years later, the maths has all changed. And so it now feels like the nation can't afford the welfare state. There's some other dimensions to that. For example, that an enormous percentage of healthcare costs go on people in their last 6 months of life, probably even more in the last 10 months than since the pandemic started. But leaving that aside, treatments to keep people alive a little bit longer have got more, greater and greater, but more and more sophisticated and more expensive, both in the training of staff and in the significant, the depth and technology of the instruments. So we've got an unbalance. So there's a consensus in the political world that the welfare state needs another look. But actually, just to introduce the book, really, Russ and I and another friend went out for dinner together about 6-7 years ago now, and we were talking about all these things, and we were also talking about Christian interaction with some of these areas. And one of us said, I can't remember who, what we need is another Beveridge report. And then we totted up the maths in our head, and we realized we're coming up to the 75th anniversary. So we said, well, nobody else is volunteering to write one, so why don't we do it? So that's how the book came about, and I'm very happy to say it came out on the 75th anniversary of the publication of the original Beveridge report, which was kind of satisfying. And it's designed to say Beveridge got some things right, but we need to have another look at some other things. And
in that look at other things that are going on, you talk about how the church can help out in welfare, speaking to that situation, and you talk about this fascinating talk about a social action spectrum. Russ, perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about what you mean by this social action spectrum and how it kind of helps talk into what we've mentioned.
Let me give you a bit of a lead into that, because just building on what Sam said there, the part of my week when I'm not at the Good Faith Partnership, I work for the shadow welfare minister in the House of Lords. And so what we've got is, as Sam said, a system, 80 odd years ago where there was really no welfare. It was largely what churches were doing to support the most disadvantaged and dispossessed people. We then have a process whereby essentially, the Beveridge report allows the government to sort of nationalize what were previously largely church-run programs, providing support and compassion for the most disadvantaged and vulnerable people. And obviously now, as Sam says, we have a really complex welfare system, which my boss in the House of Lords has to kind of challenge the government to maintain and improve. And that puts the church in a really different situation. So we've gone from being 80 years ago the welfare providers within our country to then watching government almost take that off our hands. And over the last sort of 20 years, if Sam and I look back on our ministry within the Christian church, something else has happened, which was actually government has said, you know what, it is becoming very complex and very expensive, and we're not sure just bigger government departments and bureaucracy are the best way to deliver this. And so increasingly, having nationalized it in the first place, our government has taken the welfare system and says, we'd quite like someone else to do it now. We'd quite like someone else to provide the children's centre and run the library and bid for that health contract and whatever. And so now we live in a situation where the government wants to oversee the system, and most of the time wants to fund it, or at least fund part of it, but is looking for other people often to provide it. And Sam and I were very, from our very different perspectives, we're both aware that actually some of that was coming back to the church. And if you're a church leader, you're left thinking, well, what do I do? Because they're closing the local library. Do I bid that the church could take over the library? Or I've got an opportunity to run the local children's centre or open a nursery, or now they need a place for the night shelter for the homeless. And actually what we found was church leaders have all these different choices to make about how they express their ministry in forms of social action, how they engage with the community and meet some of these needs and work with people who are often some of the most challenged and vulnerable. And actually it's a really difficult system to say, well, what should I do? Should I do this? Should I do that? And most importantly, what is there a theological rationale or a missional reason to do? Because there's no way that my little church community can meet all the need that is here in my neighborhood. And so we developed this sort of social action spectrum as a way of saying, look, there are many different ways that churches can engage with their communities in this way. There's many ways, and it's not that one form of social action is better than another, but what is really important is for churches to know what kind of social action they're called to, or they're best placed to do, or they can have the most impact by offering. And so that we wanted to give people a spectrum that says, okay, when I look at this issue, whether it's about whether I should run the children's centre, or whether we should look after a night shelter, or whether we should bid to the council to win that contract, to give people a kind of framework and ministers a framework to make those decisions. And if it's all right, I'll share my screen, hoping this is going to work. You should be seeing a slide, is that correct?
We are indeed.
Excellent. So this is our social action spectrum. And there's 5 points on the social action spectrum, and I'll talk you through it. There's contradiction, contrast, complement, collaboration, and co-option. Now, no Baptists were involved in the creation of this book, but we decided for the Baptist community, we would go for 5 C's and go with alliteration as a mode of communication. So here we go, very quickly. Contradiction is when you decide that our engagement with social action as the church community is to actually speak against what we see going on in our community, and maybe speak against what the government is doing. And so this is where this is campaigning, this is advocacy, this is protest, this is saying, actually, this is not right. And we as the church are going to stand against that. We're going to make a prophetic stand and demand that we find another way of doing this in our community, for our community. And so an example of that, I'm going to try and pick examples from the pandemic. An example for that would be, St. Marcus Rashford and the school meals process. Yeah, so the government decide they're not going to extend free school meals vouchers over the summer holidays. And many churches join people like Marcus Rashford and other high-profile people in saying that is not correct. In fact, to be fair, churches were long saying that for months before Marcus Rashford came out, but I'm a Manchester United fan, so I'm going to support Marcus Rashford as well. So anyway, churches saying, look, this is just not right. And churches were prepared to stand in and fill the gap if government didn't do that. But actually government did turn around and they did extend the scheme, and actually still that wasn't enough, and we were part of a project to help deliver 1.8 million meals to vulnerable families over the summer holidays. But contrast is where you stand against what's going on and you try to say contradiction, and say this needs to be done differently. The second point on the spectrum is contrast. And that's where a church says, look, this is not so much about a campaign against what the government are doing or what's going on in public policy, but this is our understanding that we are going to deliver something very different. We don't think what the state has put on offer is really enough, or we don't think what the state put on offer is really doing enough to transform, or is really what is needed by the people we're serving. And so we're going to create a different type of service. So I'm going to give you Christians Against Poverty as a contrast scenario. There's not many public services that do anything like what Christians Against Poverty do in giving debt advice, in helping people out of debt, in combining both kind of complex financial services with prayer and ministry and kind of community development work all in one. And so they're kind of saying, look, it doesn't exist. No one's doing this like this, and the church needs to do something different and offer something different. And so we're going to offer something that contrasts. In the middle, we have complement. So this might be where a church says, look, we think we can help out. We can see that there are government services in this community that are working, but actually we feel we can add a different dimension and we can increase their impact, particularly with the groups that we are working with. So I'm going to use an example called SPEAR. SPEAR is an employment program, which again has been very active during the pandemic. It works through local churches and it provides young adults who are out of work, and now actually people of all ages, because they've developed a project particularly through the Love Your Neighbour network to support churches working in the pandemic. They've developed a model which says anyone who is out of work, this is a coaching course which helps get someone back into work. So it's not contradicting what's available with the Department for Work and Pensions. It's not trying to be really different from what you get down the job centre. In fact, SPEAR actually, when job centres were open, would go and actually recruit people onto their programme from the job centre, saying, look, we can give you something that is complementary to what the job centre's given you, but actually it's also additive. It will help you to get back into work quicker and more effectively. So that's complementary work. The penultimate one is collaboration. So this is where we go a step further and churches say, well, actually, we reckon we can do something really powerful if we work with government. We can see that they have a lot to offer in this area and they're doing good stuff, but we feel we've got something as well. And rather than just offering a complementary service, we're going to get together and say, what happens if we combined our forces, combined our creativity, combined our resources and our relationships, and actually took a joint approach to a challenge? Tomorrow, I have a meeting with some of the senior Black leaders of the Black majority and international churches in the United Kingdom, with senior members of the National Health Service. Some of you will have read that yesterday it was a survey came out that said currently 72% of the Black population and a large proportion of the BAME population are likely to resist, basically not to have the COVID vaccine when it's offered to them. And so we are part of a discussion between the NHS and the Black churches in this country and churches with significant Black members of their numbers of congregation to say, well, what can we do through the churches if we bring together the knowledge and the expertise and the policy of the NHS and the Department of Health to get this vaccine out, with the social networks and the congregations and the spiritual leadership and the resources of the Black churches? Is there a way that we can help more people to access the vaccine to protect their lives and to protect the lives of others around them? The last one is the most tricky one. We call it co-option, and it's the one we don't really have many examples of. As I said, we think for any church leader, contradiction, contrast, complement, collaboration are all absolutely valid forms of social action. And in truth, most churches might be doing one or two or three of those at the different time. You might be campaigning for something in some area. You might be collaborating with the local authority in another. And that's absolutely fine, as long as you do it honestly and with integrity and honouring the relationships that you're building, both in the community and also with the local authorities. But co-option is difficult, and I don't think we've ever really had a good analogy of what a church would do if it was co-opted by the state or by a government to deliver a government service, and just that the church becomes kind of a conduit for that and doesn't seek to put its belief, its vision, its mission into practice through it. And so that's the one that we're negative about. I think we can all look back through history and look at bad sort of times when the church has been co-opted into certain situations. And some of us have been watching the inauguration of the new president, President Biden in America Day, and we could look at what comes before, and we could say that sometimes churches have been co-opted by certain parts of the administration in a really unhelpful way. So we don't really have any great positive views of co-option, but I'm going to hand to Sam because he's got a great idea.
No, I just to give an illustration, it's a bit of a crisis in Church of England schools, for example. If Church of England schools have got no Christian teachers, but cling on to the fact that they've got a church school in the neighbourhood, then that I would say is a case of co-option, because they're delivering, education that the government needs to deliver, but the degree to which that has any Christian ethos or practice is very, very limited. That would be an example.
So that's really good. Thank you, Sam. And Stuart, that's it. That's the slides. I'm going to stop sharing.
So I think that's really interesting stuff. But you also talk in the book, when revolve around welfare and kind of church social action, you talk about the difference between deficit and asset. And I don't know which one of you would like to answer this question, but just explain a little bit about the difference between when you talk about a deficit in community work or social action and an asset.
Well, I'll make a start on that because it's so crucial to the ethos of the book for a number of reasons. The first is, let's just take people back. Well, it's too close to the bone to talk about our current circumstances. So I'll start by talking about the Second World War. If you think about people talk about the Second World War, obviously there was hardship, there was rationing, people were losing relatives in the war. There was great adversity. However, probably everyone on this call has got a grandparent or a parent who is the needle's been a bit stuck about talking about we never used to have to lock our doors and we really trusted each other and we knew each other and relied on each other. And we had a great sense of community. So that's what that's saying, is that your tangible circumstances, the kind of things that can be evaluated easily and counted, are, like your income level, are not the whole of what counts as well-being, or what you might call faring well or welfare. There's another dimension, which is about what you might call the positive goods, rather than Beveridge's 5 great evils, or to use another set of language, particularly associated with asset-based community development and the work of John McKnight, the difference between talking about somebody's deficits or a community's deficits and talking about a person or community's assets. And so while Beveridge obviously did a fine job of identifying the deficits, squalor and want and so on, and ignorance and so on, what we've done at the beginning of this book is to talk about what the assets might look like. And we've talked about 5 assets that would match. So the 5 assets we talk about are relationship and creativity, partnership, compassion, and joy. So to take an example, one of those is compassion. We're suggesting that you're not really living you're not fully alive if you're just receiving compassion. You've got to be showing some, that it's actually ennobling and makes us more human and more fulfilled as human beings to be showing compassion. In fact, it's not really healthy if you're not in some sense in a position to be imparting compassion to somebody else. So then the next step that we make, and it's perhaps the biggest single proposal that's in the book, is to say that the church has 3 roles. It's first of all in this social sphere, it is to hold the government to account about working on the deficits. It's to recognize that deficits aren't the only issue in this game, that assets are in many ways just as or more significant, and then to concentrate on its own special work of cultivating assets. And what we argue is that the church is, in many cases, much, much better placed than government to cultivate assets, but can often lose its way when it tries to replicate the work of government in addressing deficits. That's just not to say that the kind of work that Russ was talking about earlier, the 1.8 million meals over the summer, those and a food bank would be the most obvious example of this, are perfectly appropriate as provisional measures that show compassion, develop relationship, and also are a prophetic witness, so that you can then say to the government, we're not just telling you what to do. It's not like something must be done and somebody else must do it. We've been doing this, but don't you think this is what government is actually for? To use a military analogy, the Vikings were invading. Obviously, you do what you can to stop them, but then you hope that somebody with a long Anglo-Saxon name is going to come up behind you from the government of the day and bring a military force with them and take it out of your hands. It's perfectly appropriate to make an initial response, just like first aid, but it's not where strategically you ought to be in the long term. But there is a place where churches should strategically be in the long term, and that is cultivating assets. That is giving confidence to an asylum seeker who is a perfectly able and competent person, has shown unbelievable initiative coming to this country and taken incredible risk, but has no human connection, has no ability to find anyone to vouch for them, and may turn out to be a dentist for all you know. But without making the relationships and having the opportunity to exercise their career, just giving them a sandwich is not appropriate Christian action. Cultivating that person's assets is appropriate Christian action, and so the government does with the debt deficit. So it's slightly overdrawn, but actually, I don't know about Russ, but I'm yet to find anybody, when I've taken this around and I've talked about this in Australia and other places in America, I've yet to find anybody who's really undermined that basic thesis, that there's a difference between assets and deficits, that the government is best placed to deal with the deficits, and that the church is better placed to deal with the assets.
I know when I read it, the word that a phrase that came to me, was kind of sense of encouraging mutual flourishing, I think, really, to see us mutually grow. And I love the fact that you talked about bringing joy as well into people's lives. It was interesting when I advertised this and encouraged people to be part of it. One of the comments that came back is, why are we talking about all this stuff and all these papers written? Why aren't we just going out and feeding people?
Would you like me to answer that?
Yeah, I have a go.
Well, in the sense of feeding people, is if you take the assumptions behind that, the assumption is that I am vastly wealthy and endowed in 100 ways. I have huge numbers of assets, of which access to appropriate food for somebody who's undernourished is one of the just a million of great assets that I have. I don't know anything about you, Stuart, but what I know is that you need a sandwich. You can just tell it by looking at you. That I know nothing about you. I have no idea whether you're gluten allergic or anything like. I just know that you need a sandwich. You might have been a chef in the past. In other words, you're entirely defined by your deficits. I'm entirely defined by my assets, and it makes me feel a little bit better if, from my vast benevolence, I give you a crumb, literally, of comfort.
Yeah.
Is that the kingdom of God? I don't think that's the way Jesus does it. Jesus comes and spends 30 years with us. I don't see him handing out sandwiches. I see him making relationships, cultivating assets, empowering people, calling the Holy Spirit, depending on your view of Pentecost, calling on the Holy Spirit to empower people to live faithful and flourishing and creative lives. Sure, it may be, I do know you. I do know you're not gluten-free. I do happen to have a sandwich, and you happen to have missed the last bus home, and I'm happy to give you a sandwich. But that's based on a relationship, because what people who do what I call one-way traffic ministry, what they complain of if they have a drink, if that's their poison, or if they have some other social get together afterwards, they said, you know, it would have been nice if someone had said thank you. Well, you're not going to say thank you if the whole transaction has been about making me feel like Lady Bountiful and making you feel like you've got no assets whatsoever. So you've got to think about the motivation of what you're trying to do. And to me, the kingdom of God is fundamentally about making relationships in which surprising gifts come to the surface. So the good thing to say about giving a sandwich is, first of all, it's better than nothing. It shows willing. Second, you get into a conversation like we're in now about how can that be enhanced and be done better, and in a way that empowers, and you probably gain confidence and also gain humility to recognize that the person you're giving the sandwich to has got huge numbers of God's good gifts, and tell you a secret, possibly even more than you have yourself. and actually your best witness to be with them is to be with them in such a way that those suppressed gifts can come to the fore.
And I think the thing I would do very briefly, so Stuart, I grew up in a Salvation Army home, and when I was 18, I went on a year out. And I signed up, actually not with the Salvation Army, as part of my Salvation Army year out, to work with another organisation on a weekly homeless team, actually just around the corner from St Martin in the Fields on the Strand. And it was a really strange one because we had these nights of training, and then we had to go out every Tuesday night, and we were expressly told that we weren't to give any food. We were just to go, at that point, there were street sleepers in every doorway in the Strand, and just gradually move along, sit down to the next person, talk to them, try and strike up a conversation and talk and talk and talk. And the thing we realized was, firstly, there was a reason why we didn't give out food, because these people needed no types of food, because there were endless amounts of good Christians with the best motivations in the world coming every night, giving soup, giving sandwiches, giving the leftovers of pret-a-manger or whatever it was, you know, and providing those people with food. But it was the conversations and the relationships that acted as a conduit and for transformation in those lives, and led to conversations about, could we get you into a hostel, or actually, what actually is the challenge you're facing? Can we find you some secure housing? And I think, you know, we are giving food. I mean, we tried at Your Neighbour earlier in the year as part of our lockdown church report to calculate how many meals the church is giving during the kind of COVID pandemic. Now, the truth is, because agencies create different statistics, some count meals, some count households, some count individuals, it's difficult, but it is well over 5 million meals a month at the moment. I think there's probably an element which says it could be near 10 million meals a month. And so we are giving food. The church is giving food left, right, and centre. The question is, what else is it giving? And I think one of the most powerful things, when we think, if you've seen that film, I, Daniel Blake, which I made the mistake of watching on a plane, and I was right on the aisle, and I spent most of the film in floods of tears with these people walking by, wondering why I was so kind of emotionally kind of disturbed. There's lots of disturbing scenes, but the most disturbing scene, I think, is when the woman goes to the food bank, and she's been using all her money to feed her kids, and she's not eating, and she's literally starving. And she goes into a corner of the food bank and she cracks open a tin and just starts eating this cold food from the tin. And it's incredibly moving. Now, one of the points that we've made in For Good is that actually, when she goes to the food bank, she gets food, but she doesn't find the relationship in that church setting that is going to get her to a point of transformation, to fullness of life, to better health and well-being. That is not to say that there aren't food banks all over the country that provide food and that relationship that can transform someone, giving them the fullness of the gospel. Proper Salvation Army, soup, soap, and salvation. Yeah, that's not saying that there aren't, because there clearly are. But actually, as Sam says, if it is just the sandwich, we are missing the trick, because someone else can provide a sandwich, but there's something that only we can provide, you know, when it comes to that relationship that can lead to some kind of experience of good news. And
we've talked a lot about, you know, tonight, about that kind of fullness of life, the living out the values of the kingdom of God. But there are some in the church who would say to both of you, this is all well and good, but this is not the primary function of the church. The primary function of the church is just simply to tell people about Jesus. And what's your answer to that?
You need to talk to the Salvationist about that.
Well, so for me, this is how we, when we are asked to tell people about Jesus, we aren't asked just to talk about Jesus. I'm very glad to be here tonight because I'm very indebted to the United Reformed Church, because two of my great mentors, one who's got a picture on my wall here, Leslie Newbigin, and my tutor at Theological College, Colin Gunton, were both URC ministers. But for me as a salvationist, I come from a tradition that says, look, it is not just about us telling people about Jesus, whether that be on the pulpit or on the street. It's about us enacting the life of Jesus, enacting the kingdom of Jesus, enacting the fullness of what he brings. And what he brings is actually something that transforms the whole person. What he brings is an interest in our physical well-being, our mental well-being, our emotional well-being, and our spiritual well-being. He sees us as whole people. We are working at the moment on a program to help churches, which will launch in February, to get really behind rolling out the vaccine. The church has always had a ministry for healing, and some of those have been signs and wonders, and some of that was through providing health services. And in the early church, it was sticking around in plagues and pandemic and ministering to the sick and the dying. We have always been, as a community, interested in the whole person, because God is interested in the whole person. And so for us, taking social action means living out the good news of Jesus, so that they hear it, so that they taste it, so they embrace it. And for me, there is no distinction to be made between telling people about Jesus and doing the things we're talking about.
Could I just pop in on that one as well? I mean, I would be looking with a person like that to be obviously looking at Matthew 28, go into all the world, and then putting alongside that Matthew 25, when did I see you hungry? And saying the one is about the asset that we've been given, which is the gospel, that we are obliged to share and take joy in sharing. The other is about the asset that the other has been given. Do you really believe you've been given a gospel to share? Sure. Do you really believe that Christ is made known to you in the naked, in the stranger, in the hungry? If you believe that, you have to create opportunities to come face to face with Christ. When I first came to St. Martin, I knew I was going to be doing the Radio 4 Christmas appeal, because the vicar of St. Martin in the Fields has done that appeal since 1924. So I was no getting out of that. I thought, I can't with integrity do that without sleeping outside myself. So I did, and I learned a number of things, including things that Russ has just said. Most obviously, that it was very easy to find food. That actually wasn't an issue. That the people that I was with showed me in no time where to pick up a sausage from here, hot water from there, a tea bag from there, milk from this other place. That was dead easy. We did all that within an hour. But it was clearly, of course, the companionship that it came down to. And as I bedded down with this guy, there were two people. He said to me, "So why are you doing this?" About 11 o'clock at night by that stage. And I said, because in my tradition, I'm taught that if I want to see Jesus, the place to see Jesus is in someone like you. And he said to me, "But I'm a Muslim." And I said, "Well, that just shows that God's got a sense of humor, doesn't it?" If you take Matthew 28 seriously, you've got to take Matthew 25 seriously.
So as a denomination, we're currently going down a road that's encouraging us to think about whole life discipleship and about what that looks like. And I think it's very much mirrored in what you've just been speaking about. At least it is for me. So how important do you think it is then for us as Christians, as churches, and how we understand church on different levels, from the local church to the denomination? How important is it that we are actively involved in social action?
Well, I would say about food banks, they may or may not be good for the poor, but they're incredibly good for the church. For precisely that Matthew 25 reason, and but precisely for the reason that I talked about earlier, that is a kind of entry-level form of social care from which you graduate to more subtle and thought-through forms of care. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it, as Russ has very well put it. But you do graduate, and you think it's a bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Food and shelter may be the most basic, but you're gradually work through as you get to know a person, recognizing what their most profound needs. And then the biggest surprise, unfortunately, it's always a surprise, although it happens every time, is that the person ends up saying, and we did a bit of work to find out what the person ends up saying, that's in the book too, but we kind of knew what they were going to say, because it's what people always say, which is, do you know, I mean, I get more from it than they do. You know, that's such a cliche, but it's only like most cliches, it's only a cliche because it happens to be true. And you know, a cliche is something that is true, but people keep rediscovering because they keep forgetting, and so it needs to be keep being said. So, you know, I would constantly say, discipleship, in terms of whole life discipleship, you get involved in this work, you start by thinking, oh, I guess I probably better give something back or something. You end up, you keep doing it because you see the face of Christ in the other. You know, there's something going on here. It's about, that's why I say it's all about humility. It's about getting out of the mindset that out of my magnificence, I could give you a morsel, and getting into the mindset that says, I am hungry to meet Jesus. And, you know, I've just found where Jesus has shown up. Wasn't actually where I was expecting, but I'll take it. And I want to keep coming back.
I mean, I should have said this at the beginning, but if people listening have got some questions they want to ask, they can just put that into the question box and we'll ask those. How much do you think, though, churches have got a responsibility in kind of changing policy and stuff? You know, there's that Desmond Tutu quote, there comes a point when we need to stop pulling people out of the river and we just need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in the first place. What, you know, how much of a role do you think we have to do that?
I'd agree with that. Russ will talk about that, I'm sure, in a moment, but I agree with that 100%, except for the word responsibility. I can't bear the word responsibility, because responsibility is that out of my magnificence, I ought to probably take a bit of a care. You know, it's that if one word sums up, you know, a problematic attitude, it would be responsibility. But what you're talking about is a move from a kind of impulsive and superficial engagement to a much more strategic and systematic engagement. And, you know, that's the kind of thing that Russ is involved with doing, as he talked about at the beginning. I don't know if Russ wants to say more.
Yeah, about I would agree that the word responsibility is not the right word, because in some ways it's just a real privilege. I spend most of my life working, you know, with faith communities, largely Christians, not always, and sometimes with other civil society organizations who are desperate to change something. They're desperate to deal with the refugee crisis, or they, as Sam said, they've been moved by experiences they've had as individuals or institutions within their own history, and they can't abide to see the suffering, that the pulling the bodies out of the river, and they want to go upstream and make a difference and stop people getting thrown in. And I think there is a real privilege to work with an organization. Sometimes the challenge has become that our very institutions become reliant on that downstream work. You know, downstream work is easy to fund. When I go out to funders or philanthropists and says we're saving these people's lives and we look at the difference we're making, sometimes that's very compelling. Sometimes it's easier to get a government grant, or easier to get the public or even your church community to give. When you say we're going to invest in a process of advocacy and engagement with high-level politicians and officials to see if we can change this public policy, that's much harder. And so organizations, for all kinds of reasons, often get trapped downstream, some because they don't know anything else, as Sam said, they've never graduated beyond that immediate thing, or sometimes just because that's what they're funded to do. And the real privilege, I think, for the church is to say, but how can we create lasting change? Because when you see that, that's when you experience a real thrill. So one of the things we're doing at the moment is, in the context of COVID, it's clear that the church will have to do more work in that deficit space for the next period. You know, we aren't seeing the financial deficits quite so much of COVID yet, but we're already seeing the relational deficits, the mental health deficits. We're already seeing people struggle, and churches are having to pile in and fill some of those things because the system can't do it right now. But actually, one of the things we're starting to look at is say, well, actually, then churches need to start thinking now about employment and helping people out of debt. And some of those forms of social action that we will need to be involved in for the next 2 to 3 years, because the recovery from COVID will be longer, much longer than the crisis. And for some people, maybe even harder than the crisis, as they face redundancy, as they face eviction, as they face all kinds of challenges. And so I think one of those questions to ask for the church now, this is a strategic time to say, our country, in the same way that we had to create the welfare state after a crisis, i.e. the Second World War, we're going to have to reorganize how we run our communities off the back of this COVID crisis. And the church has a unique opportunity to work with communities to say, actually, how can we accelerate people's recovery and help them to higher ground as quickly as possible?
Okay, thanks.
I think what we're seeing, Stuart, is we're changing our notion of what's meant by charity. Charity has traditionally been, what's the little bit of help that I've got access to that you need, that fixes a problem. We've talked about how superficial that is, but also how relatively easy to fund that is, because we all like to see life in terms of problems and solutions, and we all like to think of ourselves as the person that steps right into the middle of that place. It's so satisfying. It's like mending a child's toy. You sort of feel great. Oh, I've found a solution, aren't I? Incredibly just gifted. But actually today, to pick up on what Russ has just been saying, I would always say the human condition is much more about isolation than it is about limitation. And so I would always say that it's the relationship that is the heart of what's going on. And somebody put in the chat, our food bank's as much of a problem as a solution. Well, there's I wouldn't use the word solution, but they're a blessing if they can facilitate relationship.
Absolutely.
But what's changed, and what's changed for good, no pun intended, is that now charity means, can I help you overcome the obstacles to you getting online and being able to make relationship even when you're shut in? The most amazing experiences we've had at my church have been making new relationships with people who found us online, and also reaching out to some of our different groups, mostly elderly, but not always elderly, who just say, I don't do technology, I don't do all that. And building a close enough relationship that you can spend an hour on the phone to somebody, and it doesn't have to be a staff member who does it, who says, there's a mute button at the bottom left of, there's a mute button at the bottom left of there's a mute button, and it's got the patience to do that over and over till the point where someone said, I know where it is. And then bingo, then they're teaching somebody else. And these days, relational poverty is more significant in many cases than material poverty. And helping people overcome relational poverty is the gospel. Relational poverty with God, with ourselves, with one another, and with the creation. It's all about relational poverty. The whole big book, all 66 books, all the way to the maps, is all about relational poverty.
We've touched a little bit tonight about COVID and about how that's changed over the last 10 months, the whole kind of landscape for everybody, and we're aware of it ourselves. I just wonder, kind of two questions. How much do you think your research, you're finding changes as a result of COVID? And then looking at the increased need and combining that with the decline in church attendance, are we almost at the danger of creating some kind of a perfect storm?
Can I answer the second question and let Russ answer the first question?
Yeah.
So, I mean, what happened in 1948, shall we say, if that date sums up the welfare state? So the first thing that happened was the state decided to become the church. It took over all the interesting things the church used to do. Now, the second thing that happened was how the church reacted. The church said, hallelujah, the kingdom of God has come in legislation form. What it didn't realize is that the church had overnight become really boring.
Yeah.
Because all the interesting things and useful things the church used to do, it had given away amazingly happily, and made you wonder if it ever wanted to do them in the first place. And then it had to reinvent something. And what did it reinvent? It reinvented something called spirituality. Well, it turned out only a handful of people really were interested in that. I'm not knocking it, but I'm saying it's not for everybody. And now I'm going to go out on a limb here and, you know, make myself very unpopular. People stopped going to churches that weren't very interesting anymore. Well, is that actually such a bad thing? Because the gospel can be 1,000 things, but it certainly should be interesting. And so we kind of painted ourselves into the corner of the room. Now, the irony is the government doesn't want to be the church anymore. Too expensive, too complicated, you know, all this kind of stuff. And what are we doing? We're saying, no, you've got to keep, you know, with our advocacy thing, the left-hand end of the spectrum that Russ mentioned, that it's saying, no, you've got to go on doing that. We don't want to do that. So I would say, you know, when does church decline begin? You know, when Feuerbach writes The Essence of Christianity in 1841, when Darwin publishes Origin of Species in 1850. No. I think church decline really begins when the church stopped doing useful and interesting things. So in other words, we made this bed. Now we've got an opportunity to get out of bed and actually I think we'll be judged. We won't be judged after this pandemic about whether we had enough hand sanitizer to keep a few churches open. Seriously, we'll be judged at the end of this by whether we have made contact with the most isolated people in a caring way and in a sustained way that wasn't just a casual toss out, but it was actually a genuine, repeated act of care, whether we were really with people in their hour of greatest need. And the work that Russ has been describing is giving an answer yes to that. And that, you know, that's the heart of this for me. It's not the self-absorbed, everybody's got to come to our building. That's obviously difficult. We all know that. But what's not difficult is to show love and compassion to people in any old way you can find. And you know, that's the heart of it for me.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a few things. I mean, off the back of that, very quickly, I gave a series of talks on For Good for the Salvation Army, actually in Australia, in different parts of Australia a few years ago. And a fairly renowned Salvation Army historian was present, and he took me for a coffee after one of them. And he gave me this fascinating fact. He said, did you know that actually prior to the creation of the welfare state in I think it was Sweden, one of the Scandinavian countries, that actually attendance at the Salvation Army Church prior to that was almost as high as attendance at the state church in that country. And then after the creation of the welfare state, that sort of dissipated. And his point wasn't that churches were filled with poor people just turning up because they got soup. It was filled with people who were kind of socially active, supporting, as William Booth would put it, the last, the lost, and the least. And that was the excitement of being involved in that church, was you were having such a difference. And as Sam said, we've kind of lost some of that excitement. We're definitely trying to funky up our meetings to make them more attractive on Sunday, but we've given up things that have an even kind of greater thrill about them. In terms of COVID, let me be really quick. I want to actually give a slight disclaimer, because a lot of these conversations can easily end up about food banks. We can often end up talking about what is one of the biggest phenomena in terms of churches supporting communities. And someone I noticed on the chat asked about whether food banks kind of can get into a point where they kind of foster dependency. And the truth is, we work a lot with the Trustful Trust, and obviously their model is desperately trying not to be dependent. You can only be referred so many times in the year. It is only 3 days food, because they want those churches and those other food, whatever the other organizations delivering food banks, to help people, you know, out of their situation, not to get stuck within it. But I do think within COVID, we've seen tremendous creativity. So for some of you in the Northwest, I'm massively impressed with the community grocery program that is coming out of the Message Trust across Manchester boroughs, where people actually contribute a small amount of money, so that they begin by actually contributing their assets. They're not just being given something for nothing. They give a couple of quid and they get a remarkable amount of food for that. But also, before they do that, they sit down and have a conversation with people who ask, are there other things we can help you with in life? Do you need help with this? Are you worried about your kids? Are you interested in God or church or spirituality? And they have a surprising amount of people saying, I'd really like to learn more about that. And so I think out of COVID, we're seeing some tremendous creativity in the church, and we're sort of tinkering and playing with and breaking and reinventing certain models. And I think that's really exciting. And the last thing I would say, I do think it's a real opportunity. So I worked a fair bit last year with a member of parliament called Danny Kruger, who wrote a report for the Prime Minister called Levelling Up. And one of the things that Danny explores is there's a real opportunity coming out of this crisis for the church and the state, and he means churches, not just the Church of England, no disrespect, but the churches and the state to form a new relationship and a new covenant, as he calls it. So a relationship that is deeply committed to one another and deeply committed to our country and our communities, to find a way of collaborating together so that we can help our communities in this really challenging time, and we can recover more quickly. And I do think we are, COVID is our World War II moment. And coming out of that, there is the opportunity for us to try and sort of put down the drawbridges and sort of become far more protectionist, or there's the opportunity, as Beveridge had, to do something with greater imagination, with greater innovation, something with far greater generosity and bravery about it. And I think churches helping our communities to rebuild themselves, if we can adopt that spirit, then we can see great things happening.
Let me just finish quickly, because we promised we'd be an hour, and that's approaching quickly with the two questions we've been asked. And I take this one first. Do you think that a network rather than a place-based community has led to relational poverty?
I would have said, if you'd asked me that question 20 years ago, I would have said yes, because it's there in the phrase "love your neighbor," and if your neighbor is somebody you don't know the name of, because you're all spending all your time at church 10 miles away, then you've got a problem. Yeah. However, in the last 10 months, because so much of life is the way it is as we're speaking now, I think the things have changed, and that's no longer the biggest single issue. People used to say your life is mostly affected by the 200 yards around where you work and the 200 yards around where you live. Now, arguably, that your life is most affected by the range of contacts that you build up in these ways. So I'd say my challenge to my congregation, to people on the call tonight, is how do you find ways like this, where you interact with with a bunch of strangers, rather than just with the same half dozen people, who are on kind of speed Zoom dial, if you like. So that it's a different kind of a challenge. We're still getting used to the challenges of the digital age.
And to perhaps one to finish with, should we have a church without walls? And perhaps just very, very quickly, if you think so, what would it look like?
One of my great theological heroes says that if you go into most churches, the building itself will tell you about what that community believe about where you find Jesus. And so if you go into maybe a Reformed church, you see a big pulpit because you expect to find him in the Word. In Catholic church, you find a big altar because you expect to meet him in the sacrament. All kinds of, in a charismatic church, you see the band on the stage and you expect to meet him in that contemporary form of worship. And he says that, really there are two things we can learn theologically about how we build church buildings. One, that actually the church should change its shape every single week, because God is alive. Jesus is resurrected from the dead. He's the God of surprises. And so there should be things surprising us. Now, we can't rebuild our churches every week, so that's not an option. So he said the next best option is to do church in the round. Because when we do church in the round, we have to look at one another, not a part of the building. And if we ask the question, where do I expect to see Jesus tonight? It's in you, Stuart, and it's in you, Sam, and it's in you, Stephen, and it's in all the people that I see here tonight. And I think setting up a church where, as Sam said earlier, we meet Jesus because of the people we see, whether it's in the building or whether it's on the street, whether it's at work, whether it's in our neighborhood, but helping to cultivate a church where we expect to see Jesus in one another is really what it means to create a church without walls. So that would be it for me.
Russell and Sam, that seems like a perfect point to finish on tonight. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the challenge that you've placed on us. If you want to go deeper, please go and look at the book, and not just to up their sales, but because it's a really good challenge, and I think it is at the heart of what it means to be disciples of Jesus. Thank you for your time. Good night.